The fall of the Roman Empire in 476 marks the beginning of the period in Europe known as the Middle Ages. The Roman Empire had unified much of Europe for about 500 years. After the empire collapsed, life was dangerous and difficult in Western Europe. Western Europe was threatened by three main groups. Muslims, or the followers of the religion of Islam, advanced from the Middle East and northern Africa into what is now Spain. The Magyars, a Central Asian people, pressed in from the east. The Vikings swept down from present-day Denmark and Norway. People worked hard simply to survive and to have enough to eat. People of Western Europe needed to figure out ways to defend themselves. To protect themselves and their property, they gradually developed the system we call feudalism. Feudalism provided people with protection and safety by establishing a stable social order. Under the feudal system, everyone served someone above them. The feudal system was based on a pyramid of vassals. A vassal meant someone who serves. Under this system, people were bound to one another by promises of loyalty. In theory, all the land in the kingdom belonged to the monarch, usually a king, but sometimes a queen. A great deal of land was also owned by the church. The king kept some land for himself and gave fiefs or land grants to his most important lords, who became his vassals. In return, each lord promised to supply the king with knights in times of war. A lord then enlisted lesser lords and knights as his vassals. Often these arrangements were written down. Many of these contracts survive to this day in museums. Before a lord could grant land or a fief to someone, he had to make that person a vassal. This was done at a formal and symbolic ceremony called a commendation ceremony, or the act of homage. It was composed of the two-part act of homage and oath of fealty. It consisted of the vassal surrendering himself to the Lord, symbolized by his kneeling and giving his joined hands to the Lord, who clasped them in his own, thus accepting the surrender. Fealty was an oath of loyalty made by the vassal. In it, he promised not to harm his lord or to do damage to his property. During the ceremony, the lord and vassal entered into a contract in which the vassal promised to fight for the lord at his command, while the lord agreed to protect the vassal from external forces. Once the commendation ceremony was complete, the lord and vassal were in a feudal relationship with agreed-upon obligations to one another. The vassal's principal obligation to the lord was aid or military service, using whatever equipment the vassal could obtain by virtue of the revenues from his fief. He was responsible for answering calls to military service on behalf of the lord. This assistance was the primary reason the lord entered into the feudal relationship. In addition, the vassal could have other obligations to his lord, such as attendance at his court. The vassal's obligations could also involve providing counsel, so that if the lord faced a major decision, he would summon all his vassals and hold a council. At the bottom of the social system were peasants. They were in a poorer class. They had to serve the lords, but were free in other ways. Lords rented some of their land to the peasants who worked for them. Then they went back to their little houses with floors made of earth and a thatched roof. On the walls of their houses, the peasants hung meats, tools, and dried vegetables. A peasant was more free than slaves or serfs, but they still were not completely free. They could not move or marry if the lord didn't say yes. They also could not leave the manor if the lord said no. If they escaped, they could run away to a town where they could try to live quietly without being known until they were discovered. If they did this, they would become a free man. However, some peasants, called serfs, were tied to the land they worked. The serf was in the lowest class. He was only a little better than a slave. He could not be sold away from the land, but was always sold with the land. They could not leave the lord's land without permission, and they had to farm his fields in exchange for a small plot of their own. But peasants and serfs had rights as well. They could cultivate grain and vegetables for sale, and the lord had the duty to protect them and provide them land to cultivate. If they got wealthy enough, they could buy their freedom from the lord. They also did not need to serve in the army, and they did not need to pay state taxes. They usually paid 10% of their income to the church and 10% to the feudal lord. These were known as tithes. Most lords lived on manors, or large estates. A manor included a castle or a manor house, one or more villages, and the surrounding farmland. Manors were in the country, far from towns. That meant the peasants had to produce everything the people in the manor needed. Only a few goods came from the outside the manor, such as salt for preserving the meat and iron for making tools. During the Middle Ages, people were born into a social class for life. They had the same position and often held the same job as their parents. Many of the people in a manor lived with the Lord's family in the manor house. Built of wood or stone, manor houses were surrounded by gardens and outbuildings, such as kitchens and stables. They were protected by high walls. The manor house was the center of the community. In times of trouble, villagers entered its walls for protection. Its great hall served as the Lord's court. It was also a place for special celebrations and feasts. Kings and queens, high ranking nobles, and wealthy lords lived in even grander structures, castles. Castles were built for many purposes. One of the castle's main functions was to serve as a home. Castles were also one of the most important forms of military technology. With their moats, strong walls, gates, they were built for defense. The earliest medieval castles were built of wood and surrounded by high wooden fences. The strongest part, the motte, was built on a hilltop. A walled path linked the motte to a lower enclosed court, the bailey, where most people lived. After about the 12th century, most castles were built of stone to resist attacks by more powerful siege weapons. Castles gradually became more elaborate. Many had tall towers for looking out across the land. The main castle building had a variety of rooms, including storerooms, kitchens, a library, a dining hall, sleeping quarters for distinguished guests, and the lord and the lady's quarters. Under feudalism, people gave kings and lords money and work in exchange for protection. Feudalism affected how people lived, the communities they lived in, and what they did for a job. Thanks for watching this video on feudalism. Go to my webpage, Classical World Blueprint, for more information on world history from the classical times to the Renaissance.